In the previous lecture, we learned what phrases are, a group of related words that does not contain a subject or a verb. We also learned that phrases can be prepositional, participle, or gerunds. In this lecture, we're going to learn what a clause is and what types of clauses there are. A clause is a group of related words that contains a subject and a verb. So let's look at an example. Let's compare these two sentences. After dinner, we went to the movies. Versus after we ate dinner, we went to the movies. Obviously, both sentences have the same meaning, but the first is a prepositional phrase. The word after is a preposition, and the word dinner is a noun that is the object of the preposition. The second sentence starts with a dependent clause. After is not a preposition here, but rather functions as a subordinating conjunction. How do we know? We see that the group of words has a verb, ate, and that the verb has a subject, we. So we know this is a clause, not a phrase. We also know that it is a dependent or subordinate clause because after we ate dinner is an incomplete thought. It's dependent on something to finish the thought. So, just as phrases come in two flavors, so do clauses. We have independent clauses or main clauses, and we have dependent clauses or subordinate clauses. An independent clause is a clause that expresses a complete thought. In essence, an independent clause is a simple sentence. In the example, after we ate dinner, we went to the movies. We went to the movies is an independent clause. We have the verb, went, we have the subject, we, and we have a prepositional phrase, to the movies. The sentence expresses a complete thought and could stand by itself as a simple sentence. Independent clauses may also be joined with another independent clause using a coordinating conjunction to form a compound sentence. The coordinating conjunctions are what is known as the fanboys: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Only these words can be used to connect two or more independent clauses or two or more dependent clauses. They cannot be used to connect a dependent clause to an independent clause. Also note that if you use other than the fanboys, such words as however or otherwise, and use just a comma to connect the two independent clauses with those words, you're causing a comma splice run-on sentence because these words are not coordinating conjunctions. So let's look at a couple of examples. We went to dinner and then we went to the movies. In this sentence, we have two independent clauses. We went to dinner, complete thought. We went to the movies, also a complete thought. Note the use of the word then. It is not proper. Then is not a coordinating conjunction, so it's not proper to write a sentence, we went to dinner, comma, then we went to the movies. That is a run-on sentence. You need a coordinating conjunction to combine those two sentences into a compound sentence. So we need after dinner a comma, and then we have the coordinating conjunction and, then the adverb then, and then the second independent clause, we went to the movies. In the second example, I wanted to eat Italian, but my date was hungry for Chinese. So again, we have two independent clauses. I wanted to eat Italian, and my date was hungry for Chinese. This is a contrary situation, so we use the coordinating conjunction but to indicate that contradiction or disagreement. All right, finally, independent clauses may be joined with a dependent clause to form what is known as a complex sentence. A dependent or subordinate clause, as we've already learned, does not express a complete thought. It needs to be combined with an independent clause to complete the thought. Also, a dependent clause always begins with either a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun, which we're going to look at in just a minute. The other thing that people don't often consider when writing complex sentences is that the subordinate clause contains the less important idea. In other words, the main clause contains the idea that you as a writer wish to emphasize. So let's look at a couple examples here to see how that works. Consider the following. My car does not start on cold mornings. Simple sentence, statement of fact. I think the battery needs to be replaced. Another simple sentence. Now, what if we wanted to put those into a complex sentence? We have to subordinate one of those two sentences. Now, if the idea that the car does not start on mornings is the lesser of the two ideas, that's what we would put into a subordinate clause. So, for example, because my car does not start on cold mornings, I think the battery needs to be replaced. Because my car does not start on cold mornings is a subordinate clause. The important idea I want to emphasize, though, is that the battery needs to be replaced. Another way of writing that same idea is by putting the subordinate clause at the end of the sentence by writing a sentence such as, I think the battery needs to be replaced because my car does not start on cold mornings. All right, so both express the same idea. It's just that the subordinate clause is at the beginning of the sentence versus the subordinate clause is at the end of the sentence. But what if the important idea is that the car does not start on cold mornings? Then we need to subordinate the sentence, I think the battery needs to be replaced. So we switch them. I could write, because the battery needs to be replaced, my car does not start on cold mornings. In that sentence, the important idea is now that my car does not start on cold mornings. All right, now that we know the differences between an independent clause and a dependent clause, let's review again some of our examples. We went to dinner. Simple sentence, independent clause. We went to dinner and then we went to the movies. Two independent clauses that are combined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction to form a compound sentence. After we went to dinner, a dependent clause that does not express a complete thought. After we went to dinner, we went to the movies. Here we have a dependent clause that begins the sentence. It's followed by a comma, and then we have the main clause completing the thought of the sentence. This is a complex sentence. Now, one other point I want to make here is notice that both the compound sentence, we went to dinner and then we went to the movies, and the complex sentence, after we went to dinner, we went to the movies, express the same idea. It shows a sequence of events. First we went to dinner, then we went to the movies. So, when do I choose to write a compound sentence and when do I choose to write a complex sentence? that is a style choice that is entirely up to the author. I will say, however, that typically complex sentences are a higher style than compound sentences. And the highest style of all would be a compound complex sentence where we have two independent clauses and a dependent clause. But for these examples, you really have a choice. Do you want two independents to make a compound, or do you want a dependent and independent to make a complex sentence? One point I might make, though, is that the dependent clause combined with the independent clause, as I said before, the independent clause expresses the main idea. Whereas in the compound sentence, we're basically saying in a very subtle way that both of those ideas are equally important. That's probably the only difference between a compound and a complex sentence as far as style goes. If you want the two ideas to have equal weight, then you would use the compound sentence. One way to begin a dependent clause is to use a subordinating conjunction. Page 101 of your textbook gives some common subordinating conjunctions. Which one you use depends on what you want to say. Words like after, before, since, when function as time indicators. Because, another subordinating conjunction, answers why. If specifies a condition, and so on. So the subordinate conjunction creates the condition that you want to address. Another way to start a subordinate clause is with what are known as relative pronouns. That, which, who, whom, whose, whoever, whomever, whichever. Whereas the subordinating conjunctions introduce a dependent clause that creates a condition or contrast with the independent clause, relative pronouns introduce a dependent clause that basically acts as an adjective to describe the noun in the sentence. So, as an example, the man who is wearing the black suit is a spy. Who is wearing the black suit qualifies as a clause because it has a verb, is wearing, and a subject, who. Note that is another thing to learn about relative pronoun clauses. Since they start with a pronoun, the pronoun can double as the subject or the object of the clause. Subordinating conjunctions cannot act as the subject or the object. So the clause, who is wearing the black suit, acts as an adjective that modifies the word man. It describes which man. So that leads us to a discussion of how dependent clauses are used in a sentence. I mentioned that the relative clause in the sentence, the man who is wearing the black suit is a spy, can act as an adjective. And in fact, just like phrases, dependent clauses can also act as adjectives, adverbs, and nouns in a sentence. Okay, let's look at how relative clauses and subordinate clauses can function as adjectives. They can modify a noun or a pronoun, and they begin with a relative pronoun or the subordinating conjunctions when or where. They also always follow the noun or pronoun that they are modifying. So we've seen how a relative clause acts as an adjective in the sentence, the man who is wearing the black suit is a spy. And they are a common type of adjective clause. But subordinate clauses that start with when and where can also function as an adjective in a sentence. So here I have two examples. The place where I buy my books. I buy my books is a subordinate clause. Begins with the subordinating conjunction where. It has a subject and a verb, I buy, and it is describing the place. Or, I'll never forget the day when I graduated. When is a subordinating conjunction, subject I, verb graduated, and it describes the day. Again, note the difference between a relative pronoun and a subordinating conjunction. Since a relative pronoun is a pronoun, it can function as both the coordinator and the subject of the clause. Who is wearing the black suit? Who is not only the relative pronoun, but it is also the subject of the clause. Who is? Subordinating conjunctions, including where and when, can never be the subject of the clause. So in both of my examples, I is the subject of the clause. Okay, let's look at how subordinating clauses can be used as adverbs. As you saw in the previous slide, when a subordinating clause starts with when or where, it can function as an adjective. So that implies that most of the time, a dependent clause is going to function as an adverb. So we have multiple types of subordinating conjunctions that would be used to start a dependent clause. So most of the time, if it's a subordinating conjunction, it's going to function as an adverb. And as we know, adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. So these adverb clauses can be located anywhere in the sentence, but they're usually before or after the independent clause, which means there is a punctuation rule here that many people fail to understand. And it's actually very simple. If the dependent clause opens the sentence, then use a comma after the dependent clause before the independent clause starts. If the dependent clause is embedded in the middle of the sentence, it's usually not necessary to have a comma. And if it ends the sentence, you should never use a comma. So one of the most common comma errors I see when I'm correcting people's writing. These adverb clauses also answer questions such as how, when, where, why, on what condition. So as an example, if we hurry up, we can finish this lesson in 10 minutes. Now, the dependent clause, if we hurry up, modifies the verb can finish. So it's explaining how we can finish early. And that's by hurrying up. The third way that a dependent clause can function in a sentence is as a noun. When a dependent clause is functioning as a noun, it always begins with a relative pronoun. So in other words, only relative pronoun clauses can function as nouns. Subordinating clauses cannot function as a noun. It also creates a comma rule. Noun clauses can function as the subject of a sentence because they're a noun. So, a strict comma rule. No comma should ever separate a noun from its verb. If you have a comma before the verb and after the noun in the sentence, then it's an interruption and you have a pair of commas. Otherwise, you should never have a comma after a relative pronoun clause that is functioning as the subject of the sentence. So here we have an example. Whoever studies hard will receive an A. Whoever studies hard is a relative clause that is also functioning as the sentence subject. Who will receive an A? Whoever studies hard. Whoever is the subject of the relative clause. It's also the relative pronoun. And studies is the verb. The whole clause, whoever studies hard, precedes the verb will receive and therefore is the subject of the sentence. In the second example, I think that we should wrap this up. That is the relative pronoun. We is the subject of the relative clause, and should wrap is, or should wrap up, is the verb of the clause. So we have that is not the subject of the relative clause, it's the object. So if you can think of it this way, the whole relative clause is functioning as the object of the sentence. If that grammatically is too complicated for you to understand, then just look at the first part of the sentence. I is the subject, think is the verb, and it's what do I think? That, remember, we learned is always the direct object of the verb. So the whole clause, that we should wrap this up, is the direct object of the sentence. It's the direct object of the verb think. One last point that I would like to make this regarding dependent clauses is the importance of placement. Clauses must be placed near the words they modify. And very often when you're writing a draft, you may not put the modifier in the correct place. But hopefully when you go back to do a revision or proofread, you will see that sometimes misplaced modifiers can create silly, nonsensical, funny sentences. So I have a couple examples here. Wanted, man to take care of cow that does not smoke or drink. Now clearly what was meant in this sentence is that what is wanted is a man who does not drink or smoke. But the way that the sentence is written, the descriptor, the misplaced dependent clause, is describing the cow instead of the man. So how do we fix that? We move the clause to closer to the noun that it was meant to modify. So wanted, man that does not smoke or drink to take care of cow. Now here we have a second sentence. They saw a fence behind the house that was made of barbed wire. So once again, if I'm writing and thoughts are coming into my head, I might write something out like this without really realizing that I've mislocated the dependent clause, mislocated the modifier, because in this sentence I am saying that the house is made of barbed wire when it's clearly that the fence that's made of barbed wire. So again, how do I fix this? I move the dependent clause closer to the noun it was meant to modify. So they saw a fence that was made of barbed wire behind the house.